I wanted to mention something with regard to a question that Leon asked recently. We did, in fact, record recently 2 shiurim on the topic of, in English and in Hebrew, whether the Shaliach Tzibur should recite the pasuk Adonai Sefatai Tiftach Tefilah before beginning the Shemona Esrei. So there are 2 shiurim on the subject which will presently be available, and there are plenty of sources there. But I did want to mention one idea which I realized afterwards I did not mention in the shiur, and it's an important it's a type of understanding and reading of the Rambam that one has to cultivate in order to fully understand Rambam in certain situations. So if we look for a moment at Hilchot Tefillah, Ubirkat Cohanim, I will call this up on the screen here a moment and share it with you. All right, so you should be able to see Hilchot Tefillah Ubirkat Cohanim, the very beginning of these parakim. Rambam writes, Yesh bichlalon shatem misvot aseh, as Rambam is wont to do always at the beginning of a section. One is la'avodat Hashem b'tefillah b'chol yom. That covers everything to do with tefillah. The second is levarech kohanim et Yisrael b'chol yom. That's a separate mitzvah, obviously, but it is connected to tefillah because we know that the place, the format of Ubirkat Cohanim is included within the tefillah, as part of the tefillah, the sibur. If you look at Perek Aleph now in Rambam begins by saying Miswat Aseh lehitpalel b'chol yom. Excuse me. Shene'emar Ma'vateret Adonai Elohechem. Mipi hashmu'a lemadu she'avodah zo hi tefillah. If you look at Halacha Beth, Rambam says, Ela hiyuv miswa zo kachu. שיהיה אדם מתפלל ומתחנן בכל יום ומגיד שבחו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, ואחר כך שואל צרכיו שהוא צריך להם בבקשה ובתחינה, ואחר כך נותן שבח והודיה לשם על הטובה שהשפיע לו, כל אחד ואחד כפי כוחו. Here the Rambam has defined the essential mitzvah of tefillah min Torah. You will note the Rambam said, Sheyeh yeheh adam mitpalel. Adam is in the singular. In other words, everything that we're reading here has to do with every individual. The mitzvah here is only referring to the individual. The individual is required to do min Torah, as Rambam described in the previous halacha. In halacha Aleph, Rambam wrote, Amru hachamim ezohi avodah shebalev zohi tefillah. ואין מניין התפילות מן התורה ולא משנה התפילה. משנה meaning the נוסח מן התורה. ואין לתפילה זמן קבוע מן התורה. All right, so from this point on, Rambam continues describing the basic format and configuration of the tefillah. In Perek Sheni, Rambam begins to describe the he mentions the extra bracha, Ubirkat haminim, that was added. And then he goes into various halachot, detailed halachot about where one, excuse me, Rambam goes into various halachot about where one is mavdil, recites havdalah in tefillah, and what one says in tefillah instead of the usual shmoneh esrei barachot during the week on special days, Shabbat, Yom Tov, etc., etc. All this is in Perek Sheni. Perek Shlishi, Rambam begins to discuss the zmanim of the tefillah. But before we move on to Perek Shlishi, I wanted to mention something in Perek Sheni. Perek Sheni, halacha, the Aleph or Tef, b'chol tefillah min ha-tefilot, Potheach, you will note Potheach is in the singular also. Chodem livracha rishona ve'omer Adonai Sefatai Tiftach v'yagid tfilotecha u'chashuhu chotem b'sof ha-tefillah omer yihu l'rason ibrei fi v'yichon libi lefanecha Adonai suri v'chali v'achar kach so'ed l'aharo. In other words, if only after reciting this last pasuk, which is added onto the tefillah, one steps backwards, one sees this as lichora part of the tefillah, and I discussed this in the shiur that we recorded. Does this mean, and this is the essential question, can you learn from here that this is part of the tefillah for all intents and purposes? L'chol davar v'inyan, these pesukim are now part of the tefillah, and one cannot, there's no such thing as tefillah without these pesukim in any situation. Well, first of all, I reiterate, we are talking here about the Yahid, because why? Because we haven't mentioned the Sibur. The concept of the Sibur has not come up yet in these halachot, and will not come up for some prakim yet. Second of all, the Lashon of the Rambam here is Mashma, and he says, Cheshehu hothem b'sof ha-tefillah. Mashma, that the end of the tefillah is before one gets to the pasuk Yihul Rason, and then one adds Yihul Rason. In other words, these are additions that are added onto the tefillah, and by whom are they added? By the Yahid. So now we return to the order of the Parakim, and Rambam is very, very systematic always in the way he brings the material. So Perek Shlishi talks about the Zmanim of the tefillah, Tefillat HaShahar, Tefillat Minha, Tefillat HaErev, etc., etc. And then in Perek Revi'i, Rambam begins to discuss Hamisha Devarim Ma'akavim et HaTefillah, the things that one must do before turning to this miswa of tefillah. It has to be done in a certain way, and there are certain preparations. So Rambam speaks about ta'arat hayadayim, what we might call natilat yadayim, and the way one has to be dressed, or the minimal way one has to be dressed, etc. Kavanah halev. All this is discussed in Perek Revi'i. In Perek Hamishi, Rambam continues with that, with the various things that are important that they be done before tefillah, but these things are on a lower level in terms of the urgency, the absolute necessity. So Perek Hamishi, he discusses Shemona Devarim Sarich HaMitpared. Sarich always means Lashon Lechatchila, the word Sarich. If it was something you have to do, you would say Hayav. As opposed to what he said at the beginning of Perek Revi'i, where Rambam said Hamisha Devarim Ma'akevim et HaTefillah. Ma'akev means it's Ma'akev. In other words, you cannot go ahead and daven without taking care of these things first. Perek Hamishi is talking about things that that one must in the sense of one is supposed to do so. Lechatchila, you are required to do so. But Rambam adds immediately, but if the situation is such that you are not able to do all of these things, or you just didn't bother to do one of these things, in other words, you can still say the tefillah and be say the chovah, even though some of these things were not done correctly. That's Perek Hamishi. Perek Shishi. Perek Shishi. Asur le'adam la'avor ahorei bet ha'knesset. These are various halachot to do with tefillah, things that things one should is various things one is required to do, take into account, such as in a given situation not to try and say tefillah. One has to maybe take a break first, etc. But in order to have kavanat halev, all these things are discussed in Perek Shishi. Perek Shvi'i. Here Rambam speaks about the seder of the barachot, the order, and how a person who is alone, a yahid, conducts himself. Again, we have not heard the term tzibur once yet. Hasn't come up at all. Rambam begins Perek Shvi'i by saying, "Kashetikenu hachamim divrei tefilot elu, tikenu barachot acherot levarech othan b'chol yom." Rambam here begins by saying that because in these, according to the order of the Mishneh Torah, Rambam has discussed previously the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, and he has been discussing here the mitzvah, and in these halachot, Hilchot Tefillah, he has been discussing the mitzvah of Tefillah, Shmoneh Esrei. Now Rambam is informing you there are certain other things, namely in this case, Birkot HaShahar, barachot that a person is to recite upon rising. And these things you are to say every day, and he describes how you do it, when you do it. Each bracha is connected to a certain action. It's to be done immediately upon when this action is performed, immediately upon rising, should not be put off. That is Rambam's view. Rambam explains these things in detail in Perek Shvi'i. And then in Perek Shvi'i, Halacha Yod Zayin. Here Rambam says, having discussed again in previous halachot, in the previous section, Hilchot Kriyat Shema, and having discussed Hilchot Tefillah, and having also discussed the various brachot that a person recites every day in the morning, including Birkot HaTorah. All this has been discussed here in Perek Shvi'i. Then Rambam says, Seder Tefilloth Kachu. This is the order of Tefillah. For whom? For the Yahid, as you're about to see. Bashahar, a person gets up in the morning, Mashkim Adam Unvarech Barachot Elu. Upon rising, a person recites these barachot, and then he reads the Zemiroth, Pesukei de Zimra, with the barachot, the Koreth Shema, etc. And he explains how you read Shema. If you're by yourself, you medaleg ha-kedusha, you do not recite the kedusha in the second bracha, Ahavat Olam, before Shema. And then, having completed Birkot Kriyat Shema, Rambam says, then you this is all B'lashon Yahid. This is all mentioned and describing the tefillah of an individual. It discusses Nefilat Apayim, And then he goes on to talk about Tefillat HaMincha and Tefillat HaErev. That's all. This is till the end of Perek Shvi'i. Till this point, Rambam has covered everything to do with Tefillah in general for the Yahid. Only at this point in Perek Shemini does Rambam begin to discuss anything about the Tzibur. Rambam begins by saying Tefillat HaTzibur Nishma'at Tamid, begins to discuss the importance and the value of Tefillah b'Tzibur. Then he also describes what is Tefillah b'Tzibur, what is the ikar, the main component and the true truly significant and important part of a minyan is the following. Rambam says, "V'chesadhi tefillat hasibur." What is the tefillah of the sibur? Yeh ehad mitpalel b'kol ram v'hakol shomeim. One person stands up and recites the tefillah, and everyone hears, listens. V'hakol shomeim. And you do not do this with fewer than 10 people. V'nosim ken v'fahut mi'asara gedolim, etc., etc. And Rambam begins to discuss the concept of a shliach sibur here. In halacha zayin, v'tzarich liot ha'asara kulam b'makom echad u'shliach sibur imahem. They have to be in the same place. You can't have a sibur divided between 2 separate rooms, for example, 5 here and 5 there, or something like that. And he said we have a minyan. Rambam discusses these various things in Perek Shemini, including what type of person is ra'ui to be appointed the shliach sibur, of a sibur of people, of 10 people or more. As Rambam writes here, halacha yud aleph, en memanim shliach sibur ela gadol sheba sibur b'chokhmato u'b'ma'aso u'im haya zaken harei ze meshubach biyoter u'mishtadarim liyot shliach sibur kolo arev u'ravil likroth, etc. And now, having introduced us to the concept of the concept of Tefillah b'Tzibur in Perek Teshei, Rambam begins to describe in detail the precise manner in which a Tefillah b'Tzibur is conducted. So Rambam begins, Seder Tefillot HaSibur. Here he mentions Sibur. When he spoke about this in Perek Shvi'i, Halacha Yud Zayin, he said Seder Tefillot Kachu. He was talking about the individual, the Yahid. Here in Perek Teshei, Rambam says Seder Tefillat HaSibur Kachu. Bashahar kol ha'am yoshavim, etc. He begins to describe how it's done, and then he goes on to say that the pores al shema goes through the shema with the barachot, and in halacha bet he says va'kol omedim miyad u'mitparlim belahash, and every person who completes the tefillah belahash v'chol sheyigmor tefillatho min hasibur yifsoa shalosh plesiot la'horo. So each person completes his tefillah, walks back 3 steps as bows and walks back whilst bowing. And then Rambam begins in halacha gimel. V'ahar she'yivsa shaliach sibur shalosh plesiot la'horo. When the shliach sibur himself completes his tefillah belahash and bows and walks back, mahil or mithpalel b'kol ram mitahilat haberachot. These words mitahilat haberachot lichora are superfluous. Why did Rambam not simply write mathil or mithpalel b'kol ram lehosi et mi shelo yitpalel? That would be perfectly plain and comprehensible. Nothing would be missing. But the fact is, Rambam added these 2 words mitahilat haberachot. Mashma bevirur, it seems clear and incontrovertible that Rambam is telling you that the shliach sibur begins from the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem. This is also how Mori Rabbeinu Yosef Gafech Zitzal in his Bir on the Rambam, he also read the Rambam in this way. He understood this from Rambam, from this lashon. And therefore you understand that which was mentioned in the second perek about adding these pesukim before and after the tefillah was referring to the Yahid. And this is not a far-fetched perush in any way, because there was no Sibur until Perek Shmini. We hadn't heard about a Sibur till Perek Shmini. And certainly nothing in terms of how a Tefillah b'Sibur is conducted, nothing at all was said till this Perek Tishei. But here Rambam is very explicit. He says, Mathil o mitpalel b'kol ram mitahilat haberachot. That's number one. So, and then of course there are other prakim here. The Rambam discusses in Perek Asiri, for example. In Perek Tishei, he continues on with regards to many things that have to do with Tefillah b'Sibur. Perek Asiri, Rambam discusses a person who made some mistake in the Tefillah or didn't have proper Kavanah Halev. And then Rambam discusses things to do with the Beth Knesset, which again has all to do with the Sibur. The Beth Knesset Mimela implies the Sibur. So the first thing to understand, the main thing really to understand here, is that Rambam's presentation of the material is always very, very systematic. There's always a very clear method to his madness, if so to speak, if we were to quote Shakespeare for a moment. Although it's no madness at all, it's all brilliantly thought out and organized. And one has to be aware of this form of order and systemized information in whatever one is learning in the Rambam to fully understand certain points. And this is one example. So Perek Shemini is the beginning of anything to do with the Sibur, with 10 people or more, where he begins to discuss this. And Perek Tishei is where he begins to discuss halakha le'ma'aseh, practically how this is done, precisely how this is done. And here Rambam chooses to say very clearly, mitahilat haberachot, which really cannot be understood to mean anything but without the pasuk, Adonai Sefatai, Tiftach Tilatecha. Otherwise, really these two words do not make any sense. It is also a fact, as I mentioned in the shiurim, that in Sidur of Sa'adia Gaon, on page Lamed Heth, Rav Sa'adia Gaon writes explicitly, even more explicitly than this, you could say. He says that when the people have finished their tefillah in the Beth Knesset, the Shliach Sibur omed bifnei teva, and he begins to say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Elokei Avotenu, etc. So Rav Sa'adia writes explicitly, word for word. If he had intended that this includes the baracha, then he would have had to say that the Shliach Sibur begins with Hashem Sefatai Tiftach, etc. But he does not. From these two sources alone, we see that these pasukim are intended for the Yahid, but they are not to be said the Sibur, by the Shliach Sibur, for various reasons that I explained in the shiurim. And they are also not to be understood as literally part of the tefillah. They have not become part of the nusach of the tefillah in the absolute sense, as I mentioned there. This, by the way, is not what the Shulchan Aruch writes in Siman Chof Yud Aleph, and I discussed this fact as well. In my experience, I have never seen in any Ashkenazi Beth Knesset or any Temani Beth Knesset, I have never seen the Shliach Sibur recite the pasuk Hashem Sefatai Tiftach aloud at the beginning of the tefillah, nor the pasuk Yul Rosalim Refi at the end of the tefillah. I've never seen this or heard this. Amongst the Sfaradim, I think the vast majority of the Sfaradim do so in accordance with what the Shulchan Aruch says. It is clear to me that minhag, that practice, is not correct, and I explained more details to do with this in those shiurim. There are a number of questions and nafka minoth having to do with this discussion. One question would be, And the Biur Halakha asks this question: what if a person recited the Tefillah without the pasuk Adonai Sefatai Tiftach? Yesai the Chova or not? If you say that it is an essential part of the Tefillah, L'chol davar ve'inyan, for all purposes, then there is no such thing as Tefillah without that pasuk. But that's not the maskana of the Hafez Chaim, and I believe Laniyut Da'ati is 100% correct, as opposed to Rav Soloveitchik Zitzal, who does make that claim. It also has to do with the question of, as we're discussing here, whether the Shliach Tzibur, as part of Chazal Hashatz, has to recite that pasuk. It's an interesting topic, and we'll leave it at that for now. And those who wish to hear more details in those shiurim are invited to do so.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.